Today, we're discussing sexual harassment investigations, and we'll be taking a deep dive into the sexual assault allegations that were made against the Chicago Blackhawks organization. We'll look at the lessons we can learn from that incident and also review some strategies that you can employ to make a safe and create a safe work environment for your staff. My name is Dorian Persaud. I am the senior lawyer at Persaud Employment Law. We are a team of lawyers that specialize in conducting workplace investigations and helping you to create healthy workplaces through investigations, training, and proactive advice. So in terms of the allegations that were made against the Blackhawks, those details came to light after a lawsuit was filed in 2021 by a former player, Kyle Beach. And he indicated that during the 2010 playoff run, he was sexually assaulted by a coach. However, the team didn't take any reasonable steps to pursue those allegations and didn't do so at the time or in the years subsequent, and therefore he came forward with a lawsuit seeking compensation. The details of that lawsuit and subsequent investigation helped us to learn that the athlete Kyle Beachy brought these allegations to light in a timely manner. At the time that they occurred, he came forward and said, look, here is what happened to me. But the team was in the midst of the Stanley Cup playoffs and didn't want to entertain these allegations because they thought that it would be a distraction for the team. And they wanted to keep the focus exclusively on pursuing the Stanley Cup, which they ultimately won that year. So they pushed these allegations off to the side and saw it as an issue that they could just deal with in the off season. They certainly didn't take the steps to contact law enforcement to let them know that a possible sexual assault had occurred. So this was kept quiet internally, and no external third parties were notified of the incident. After the season ended, the team approached the coach in question and really gave him a proposition of participating in an investigation or being packaged out. And he was eventually packaged out and provided with a reference letter. This coach would go on to coach other high school and college programs where there were more victims of his more victims of his, and those parents and athletes came forward with their own complaints subsequently. So not only did you have the former athlete for the Chicago Blackhawks, Kyle Beach, that was victimized, but you had this trail of young men who were the victim of this coach, all because the organization was looking for a way to make this go away without causing any disruption to their image and avoid a PR stunt. Well, lo and behold, they failed on all these different fronts, right? You had the victims of crime, and then the situation escalating and becoming something that the NHL and the league office got involved in. You had the lawsuit that was ultimately resolved, and a number of key individuals who ended up losing their jobs because of how this situation was handled. So certainly, in terms of doing this work, you want to make sure that you're going about your work in an authentic way. And sometimes when we scheme to do what we think is best, quote unquote, best for the organization, it ends up being the worst possible outcome for everyone involved. And so the path that we advocate for is, again, just doing this work authentically, living up to the values that are in your workplace policies, and doing your best to create a healthy workplace and respond to misconduct in an appropriate way, regardless of what might be going on in your organization at a given point in time. Now, and I think that contextual piece is something I'd like to just speak to a little bit more before we jump into the actual ins and outs of conducting a sexual harassment complaint. When we look at these allegations in isolation, many of us, if not all of us, would agree in terms of what needs to be done, right? Like we have a policy that indicates sexual harassment will not be tolerated. We might have in that policy a procedure that needs to be followed, both from the perspective of the complainant and then from the organization's standpoint. Once you become aware of the allegations, here are the steps that are going to unfold. But these incidents don't happen in isolation. There's a whole context here, and in this case, you have a sporting team that is pursuing a championship, and all of the systems of that organization are geared towards that event. The way that they measure success is in winning a championship. For some private sector organizations, it might be success is defined in terms of how much money do we make. We're trying to sell a product or a service. And so if you have a high-flying investment banker who is bringing in a lot of money, it's easy for that individual, right, to be protected in a given organization. In a university context, certainly being involved in investigations where you had a high-flying individual who is well published, who is frequently asked to give interviews and to participate in various speaking events. Do you want that high-profile individual who brings so much goodwill and resources and funding to the university? Do you really want that person to be involved in a workplace investigation where there's serious allegations of sexual harassment? And so that's the piece, as HR professionals, that we have to wrestle with, is that we have to know how to conduct these investigations and do so in a way that will stand up to scrutiny. At the same time, we don't want to lose sight of the fact that these incidents are occurring within a specific context, and that sometimes you have to fight for the policies to be followed and for the right thing to be done. So we're going to, again, take a deep dive into how the Blackhawks handle the situation, lessons that we can learn there, and also look at what steps you can then implement to create a healthy environment in your workplace. When it comes to sexual harassment, oftentimes we're talking about unwanted comments or unwanted conduct or both. And we're always looking at a spectrum of bad behavior. So on the lower end, you have inappropriate comments that are made, and that escalates to inappropriate pictures that are shared, and all the way up to sexual assault. In the case of the Blackhawks, you had a number of comments that were made. You had inappropriate touching and ultimately a sexual assault. You also had explicit photos that were shared between from the coach to the player. So you want to, as you're doing these investigations, you want to be mindful of the fact that there's a whole host of evidence that you need to be aware of, and that you want to pursue and find out what exists, and ultimately collect all of the evidence that's out there as you go about doing your work to figure out what happened and what your findings should be, and then ultimately what the consequences should be on the back end of your investigation. In terms of sexual harassment, what we often see is that these cases involve a power imbalance. So you often have a relationship where one of the individuals believes that the other individual is in a position to grant a benefit, and it might just be an unspoken quid pro quo, right? If you do this, I'll do that for you, or if you do this, I'll refrain from doing something that might penalize you or harm you or create some sort of an obstacle for you going forward. So that's always something that you have to be mindful of. In the professor-student context, I've seen this where the students believed that the professor held the keys to a better job, or some key jobs in their chosen field of study. And therefore, if you didn't play ball with the professor, he might be able to withhold these choice jobs from you. We see in the Chicago Blackhawks situation, you've got an athlete and a coach, and to some degree, the athlete saying, buying into the fact that, hey, this coach might spend more time with me and will speak well of me to other coaches, and introduce me to other players and help me advance in my career, and ultimately achieving my goal of reaching the NHL. And so those, it's that power imbalance that is one of the things that allows these situations to develop and become more involved, and ultimately problematic. Another aspect here for us to consider is the fact that you often have these intersecting factors that create the environment for sexual harassment and sexual assaults to incur. And in many cases, what studies have shown is that the victims of sexual harassment, they present with certain issues. Maybe they have been abused in their past. They may be dealing with an addiction. Maybe they're dealing with issues of identity, or gender expression. There's many different factors here, but oftentimes you do have these issues present, and it's that vulnerability that the responding party is then able to take advantage of. So that's something that you want to be mindful of as you conduct these investigations, is that power imbalance and the particular vulnerability of the complainant in question. So what we'll look at in terms of how the Blackhawks handle this is, number one is process. And what process are you going to follow when you are faced with these allegations of misconduct? What are your priorities as an organization? Right? Oftentimes we have those priorities highlighted in our policy, but is that ultimately what's driving us, or is it more of a win at all costs approach? And then we're going to look at, again, the damage that was caused both at the individual level, and then at the higher organization and reputational level, and ways that we can mitigate that and avoid that harm from occurring. So when it comes to sexual assault, that it clearly is a violation of a person's right to enjoy a workplace that's free of violence and harassment. It's a criminal offense, and so you've got the police and criminal justice system that's involved, maybe conducting a parallel investigation while you are conducting your own internal investigation into the issues. So there's a lot of moving parts to these investigations. A question I'm often asked is, hey, Dorian, do we even need to investigate this if the police are involved? Aren't they just going to handle this? And my answer to that is that yes, you do have to investigate, and you have to understand that other parties are looking at this from different perspectives. So internally, you're looking at this investigation from the perspective of, has there been a violation of our policies? Was there sexual harassment here? And did that violate our policies? What are the steps that we need to take in response to that? From the perspective of the police and the criminal justice system, they're also looking at that incident. They're like, has there been sexual harassment or sexual assault? Is the criminal offense? And to the extent that there has been an assault, can we prove that beyond a reasonable doubt? Is this a charge that we can then prove and take forward to a prosecution? And what's the likelihood of success on that prosecution? So that's the way that the issue is being weighed by the prosecutor, and to some extent by the police, as they're going through their investigations. So there's overlap in terms of the evidence that they're collecting and looking at, but they're looking at it through a much different lens than what you'd be looking at than the lens that you're looking at it from an internal perspective. And then there might be regulatory bodies involved here, to the extent that you have teachers involved or other professionals involved. There are professional bodies that might be looking at this from a professional discipline perspective and looking at, to what extent there's been a breach of the ethics and the applicable code for that profession, and then what are the consequences in terms of findings. So you might have these parallel investigations taking place, but that doesn't relieve you as an employer uh, of doing your own internal investigation, whether on your own or through the help of a neutral third party to figure out what happened and take the appropriate steps for your workplace. In terms of setting up the investigation, again, when you're dealing with such serious facts, or if you're dealing with high-profile individuals, I think it's natural for us to get nervous. Maybe our palms get sweaty. You're trying to figure out, hey, what's the right thing to do here? And you want your starting point to be just go back to the principles of natural justice, right? In terms of what this process should look like. At the end of the day, the individuals involved have a right to be heard by an impartial fact finder. So whether that's someone internally or an external professional, the individuals who have either brought the complaint or are responding to it, they have the right to be heard by someone who's approaching this saying, I'm interested in finding out what happened here. They're not approaching it from the perspective of, hey, what questions do I need to ask to minimize the company's liability? Or how do I come into this and really support the victim and make sure that they get justice, right? Like that's not the way that you're approaching this as an investigator. You want to make sure that the person coming in is dispassionate, and understands the allegations that have been made and is able to really get to the heart of the issue and determine the truth of what occurred between the parties. You want to make sure that the responding party is aware of the allegations that have been made. So that means we're not calling them into a meeting and blindsiding them with these allegations, right? We are putting together a list of the allegations. We are including enough detail in that list to say, here is what is alleged to have occurred, and here is when these statements were made or when these events occurred, and providing enough detail so the person can turn their mind to that event and come to the meeting prepared to give a fulsome response. And then you want to make sure that whatever decision's made, it's being done by the person who actually heard the evidence, right? So you don't have one person investigating and interviewing the parties or relevant witnesses, and then just handing off their notes to somebody else saying, okay, here's what I collected, you figure out what happened. No, it's the person who conducted the interviews, who heard the evidence firsthand, who is then able to kind of sit with that evidence and wrestle with it, make any applicable credibility assessments that need to be made, and then ultimately making a conclusion as to whether or not there's been sexual harassment or some other policy violation here. Some of the mistakes that we often see made and that we saw made in the case of the Chicago Blackhawks was, up until the lawsuit was filed in 2021, and at that point they retained an external third party to investigate. Up until that point, they didn't have an impartial person investigating it. They had folks that were doing it internally who either weren't trained to conduct a sexual assault investigation, and folks who were approaching it from the perspective of, how do we protect the Blackhawks? How do we conduct this investigation in a way that ultimately helps us to negotiate with Kyle Beach and reach a resolution, right? So they're not looking at this from a dispassionate perspective of, hey, what happened here? Let's get to the bottom of that. They're looking at it, from the perspective, how can we ultimately protect the organization here? So you want to avoid that, and that's not just a mistake that the Blackhawks made. I see this repeatedly in the cases that I review and in some of the investigations that I'm asked to come in and participate in. Sometimes what you're doing is really cleaning up a mess that's been made because the initial inclination was, how do we cover this up? So you want to make sure that that you're learning from those mistakes. You also want to make sure that when you're dealing with a sexual harassment complaint, that you understand, or the investigator understands how to do that using a trauma-informed approach, right? So victims of trauma, they um, are known to, want to block out that experience. They're trying to repress that memory of that awful thing that happened to them. There are going to be certain details that they can't remember, or maybe details that they remember, but they can't recall the exact timing and sequence of events. And so using a trauma-informed approach is important in terms of, letting that individual know that uh, allowing them to tell their story, letting them know that, not requiring them to tell their story in a very rigid way, but really just as the investigator sitting back and allowing them to tell their story in their own words. That's important. It actually creates more work for you as the investigator, because you then have to jump in and fill in these gaps as you've identified them going along. So you definitely have to be paying attention and taking good notes, and you're trying to create that sequence of events, right, and that timeline for yourself. But as you're going through the interview, you want to be mindful, not to interrupt the witness. You want to let them tell their story and then go back and fill in the gaps as you've identified them. So keep in mind here that when you're conducting these investigations, you have a lot of eyes that are on you. Certainly, confidentiality is important, and nobody knows the questions that you're asking in that moment. But folks in the organization, they're looking to see, like, look, to the extent that complaints are made, does management take these things seriously, and are they actually going to follow through? So there's a lot riding on the investigation, both from a micro perspective of what's happening in this individual case, but also from the macro perspective of the culture that you're helping to create or reinforce. Uh, you want to make sure that you're getting it right, that you're going through at least implementing the right process, because that's what's going to give confidence to your staff at the end of the day. That's going to reinforce the belief in the policies, and really indicate to others that we live by these values that we are publishing and putting out there in the world. In the case of the Blackhawks, they had the right policy, but in terms of what they actually did, they were saying, look, we're saying that these things matter to us, but really, in the context of the playoffs, they don't matter when the playoffs come, right? And so we're going to put team chemistry and player safety, those things kind of go to the side. Really, we're just focused on winning the cup, and then we can deal with these things afterwards. So again, you want to have your values, but you want to be consistent in terms of how you're living out those values, because that's what employees are looking at. That's what they're going to take away from the situation. Mhm. Another issue that we often see, and this is we see this with organizations of all sizes, but specifically with larger organizations, oftentimes as an HR professional, you're just inundated with so many requests, and you might have a number of complaints that are coming at you, and you don't know if these complaints are all related to one investigation, or if these are separate complaints. And with all of the priorities that are on your plate, it's easy for certain things to get missed. And so you want to make sure that you are, responding to these, I'll call them complaints, but these communications in a timely way. So whether that communication is coming via email, whether it's coming via an instant chat, or maybe there's a dedicated portal that employees use to submit these complaints, you want to make sure that you're on top of it, and you're at least and doing two things. Number one, you're acknowledging their communication in a timely way. So folks aren't sitting there saying, hey, I complained, or I submitted this communication to this HR professional, and I'm waiting 2 months for a response. You want to make sure that folks, that they know, and the person may have read it, by the way, right? So the HR professional read it and is taking action on it. But sometimes there isn't that email to the person who sent it, or a response to the person who sent it to say, hey, yes, I want to acknowledge receiving this, and we're taking steps. I've seen that cause problems in many workplaces where steps were being taken, the organization was being diligent in pursuing it, but then they got a human rights complaint because the employee said, "Hey, I submitted a complaint. I didn't get a response. I don't think they're taking it seriously, so I just consulted with my union and I went to the Human Rights Tribunal." And so now the situation got a little bit more complicated simply because the employee didn't think anything was being done. So you want to make sure that you are aware of what your systems are for receiving complaints, and then just make sure that folks are being diligent in terms of following those systems. Another thing here too is just identifying, look, if things are getting busy and there's just a lot of complaints coming in general or during a particular season, you want to make sure that that staff feel that they can, that they can bring that forward and they can kind of get some help to properly address those concerns. The other piece of this is, after acknowledging the complaint, just putting in place the process right away. I think most organizations, I would say, are good at that piece in terms of, once they make the decision to investigate, they're usually pretty good at implementing that step and starting the investigation. But certainly, we see examples where whether maybe the complaints come up in the summer months and you got folks on vacation and maybe it's difficult to find an external third party that's available. There's a lot of reasons why sometimes during certain times of the year, vacation schedules or other factors result in these issues getting delayed and not really addressed in a timely or in an urgent way. So that's something to be mindful of, because the longer you take to start a process, the longer you take to undertake that investigation, you're dealing with issues of memory loss. I've had investigations where witnesses ultimately left the organization in the time that it took them to start the investigation, and now you're dealing with those folks not really having an obligation to participate in the investigation, and it just makes it that much more difficult, right? Depending on if these are key witnesses or not, to really figure out what happened. So those are things that you want to, again, you want to avoid, and you can avoid that by just moving ahead quickly with the investigation and giving it the priority that that it needs. There's often a tendency to think that because you've maybe had a conversation or an initial intake interview with a meeting with the complainant, or maybe the person just filed a 20-page complaint. I've seen on a number of occasions where there's that initial thought that, okay, I think I understand what the complainant is complaining of. We have this 20-page complaint. Let's just go off and run with it from here. And they take that step without having a formal investigation interview with the complainant. And that's a mistake. You want to make sure that whether it's the complainant or the respondent, that you have met with that individual, you conduct an interview with them, even if you have substantial materials in writing. You want to make sure you meet with them just to confirm that, yes, you understand their story, you understand the flavor of these allegations or their response to the allegations, and you're moving forward on that basis, not assuming that you have all the information that you need just based on what's in writing, or maybe a brief interview that your colleague may have held with that individual. I find it extremely helpful to have a transcript of your meeting with the parties and witnesses. Back when I started doing this work 17 years ago, I was taught, and it was natural for me to just type my questions and type my answers, and that's the way we did it. And I still do that today, but now many investigations are done via video conference. And so it's really easy to record the investigation interview, and then you're still taking notes as you go along, but you're able to prepare a transcript at the end of the interview based on that recording. And so that's a helpful thing to do that I would recommend. And then you want to take that transcript and have the witness confirm that, yes, this is accurate. This is what I actually said. And sometimes witnesses want to add, they might have forgotten a detail, or there certain things that they may have indicated incorrectly. So they have the opportunity to to add to the record at that point in time. But that's helpful in your process, because on the back end, after you're making conclusions, someone can't turn around and say, "Oh, I actually didn't say that to the investigator," and he or she recorded that incorrectly, and look, you've made this finding against me, and that's not accurate at all. So you want to avoid that situation, and one of the ways you can do that is by having an accurate transcript of what occurred. In many sexual harassment cases, the case really comes down to credibility, and that credibility is often determined based on the documents that you review, and those documents include emails and text messages in many cases, communications on various social media platforms. So I've benefited from getting access to that evidence in terms of resolving the sexual harassment complaints that I've been involved in. So you want to do your best to figure out what's out there and make sure you access it and review it and really hang your hat when it comes to credibility on that, as opposed to someone's behavior or their demeanor and body language during the investigation interview. Certainly you can look at things like demeanor, but that's not. It's often not the most solid of ground to make a conclusion. So again, you want to make sure you've got something that is reliable that will help you. I'll give an example. I was interviewing a professor in a sexual harassment case, and over the course of the interview, he basically was saying to me, look, Dorian, this was a consensual relationship, and if at any time the student told me that she's an adult, and if at any time she told me that that my behavior was unwelcome, I would have stopped. If she had said no, I would have stopped sending her messages. And I then pulled out all of these text messages where she was saying to him, look, I don't want you to text me. Just send me an email if you've got something to say. I don't want you to text me if about personal issues. I just want you to communicate on things that are related to the course, and just do that using my my regular email address. I don't need you calling or texting me. And so there's all these examples, and it was really ended up being death by a thousand cuts, right? As we went through this interview with him, it was very clear she was saying no, and he was proceeding in any event despite that caution. So that's the kind of thing that you're looking for, is just making sure that that you're getting access to all of the relevant information, and that's going to help you really get to the heart of understand the context of the relationship, and really get to the heart of what occurred. When it comes to findings, you want to make sure that you're able to make a finding on every allegation. So you don't want to conduct the investigation and then at the end of the day be like, well, this person said this and that person said that, and so we don't really know how to conclude this or how to make a finding here. You want to go through the process and on each of the allegations make a finding, and sometimes that involves if you're not able to wrestle with it, getting somebody else involved and having them uh, come in. We're sometimes called in to look over an investigation and see, can it be salvaged, and are there things that we can do to make a finding, or is it a situation where we just scrap the investigation and start from scratch? So you want to make sure that at the end of the day you're able to get to the bottom of what occurred. And you want to make your findings, based on all of the evidence, and be able to explain, look, here's all the evidence we collected, and here's why we prefer this person's evidence over that person's evidence. Here's why we're giving more weight to this person's evidence over another. So, these are the things that you're looking for and that you want to explain as you're going through the investigation. And then keep in mind, I'm often asked, hey, Dorian, like, what if we get it wrong? And, keep in mind that the standard here isn't perfection, and you don't have to prove that something happened beyond a reasonable doubt, right? You're looking at proving something on a balance of probabilities. So, we often think of that as, 50% plus one, right? Like, is it more likely than not that this event occurred? And that's what you're looking for. Is it possible that you can, on that basis or on that standard, that you might get it wrong? Sure, it's possible. Again, we're not aiming for perfection here. We're looking at, being comprehensive in terms of the questions we ask and who we meet with and the evidence we collect. And then, again, making a determination on a balance of probabilities and doing the best with the skills that we have. Another question that comes up is, is intent relevant? So, the person may have acted this way, but they never intended for this to be the outcome. So again, where intent is relevant in some criminal law charges, when you're conducting a workplace investigation, you're not looking at intent. It's whether or not the person knew or ought to have known that their conduct was unwelcome. And if that's the case, then you can make a finding of harassment or sexual harassment. So the issue of intent or remorse or whatever the case might be, you might factor that in on the back end in terms of should what should be the appropriate response here. Yes, there's been a finding that there's a policy violation. What's the next response? Are we going to discipline the person? Are we going to terminate the individual? Is there room for reconciliation here? The issue of the individual's remorse is something that you might factor in to that to what happens on the back end of the investigation, and again, only in the appropriate circumstances. When it comes to the findings, you want to communicate the findings, and you have a legal obligation to communicate those findings to the complainant and the respondent. Oftentimes, other people who are involved in the investigation will want to know, hey, what happened here? And they don't have a right to know. Again, it's the investigation is confidential. Obviously, any discipline or other action taken on the back end of the investigation is confidential as well. So it's only in very unique and very high profile cases that some of these details may be made more broadly known. But for the most part, for your investigations, you want to make sure that you preserve confidentiality over the process and the findings and the response to those findings. When it comes to Kyle Beach, again, we talked about the lessons that we can learn, and one of the things that we see from the Chicago Blackhawks situation is that there are real people that are affected when we put organizational priorities, or we have other goals that we put before the human complaints that are brought forward. And it's that refocusing on the human element of this, saying, look, at the end of the day, yes, we're trying to achieve all of these things, and those things are great. But however, none of those things really matter in the face of the human element here. And so we have to, at the end of the day, be respectful and honor people in the workplace, and certainly be mindful of the extreme harm that's caused by sexual predators in the workplace. In this case, you've got this coach who not only harmed Kyle Beach, but then went on to harm other high school and college kids, and all of that harm could have been avoided. So it's that recognizing that that real impact and not losing sight of that, despite the lofty and the good goals that an organization might have. How can we prevent situations like this going forward? I mean, these are complex cases, right? And there's so many different layers and levels to them. And how can we ultimately come out ahead and try to prevent these types of things from happening in the first place? And one of them is, making sure that you've got your mission statement and values, and your policy is out there indicating, look, here's what we believe. And while that's a legal requirement and something that many organizations have, I've certainly seen room for improvement, and not all organizations have that. So you want to make sure that at a minimum, your organization's given some thought to that, and publish a policy that speaks to the type of work environment that they're trying to create and affect. The other piece of it is that even with the policy, how well distributed is that policy? Is it reviewed and updated? Are folks, trained on the policy? These are all things that oftentimes the policy sits there, maybe on a bulletin board in a boardroom, maybe it sits there on the intranet site, but it really isn't something that people know about, right? I think it's really just HR folks and lawyers, right, that are reviewing policy on a regular basis. Like, most of the people who work in your organization don't spend their time with their head buried in a policy. So uh, again, you might have the best language in there, but if people don't know it and if it's not spoken about and raised, periodically at team meetings and at the senior management level, then those policies don't really get to take root in people's minds and don't really become part of the culture and they aren't top of mind in terms of how folks are making decisions. So that's the key piece. We all know that there's a lot of turnover in an organization. So to what extent are we keeping this top of mind for those new folks that are coming in, and then also regular reminders for the people that have been there for a while. Another issue is the to what extent folks are trained on the policy. I conducted an investigation recently where the organization was able to prove that everyone coming in goes through an online training module, and they get this refresher on the policy, and that refresher, these modules indicate how to go about and file a complaint. And so there was every reason for HR to believe that, yes, folks know about the policy and folks should know how to file a complaint under the policy. But when I was doing the investigation, many of these witnesses, if not all of them, said, we don't know how to file a complaint. And this was shocking news to the folks in HR. And so again, sometimes it's hard to explain and why you have that disconnect between you and HR, having systems in place to make sure that key information is known to staff, but then at the same time, staff, on the front lines, not getting it, or this information that you think is known, not being known to them. So it's sometimes it's only through an investigation that you identify that gap, and then you can take steps to address it. And then and that speaks to the final bullet point on this slide, that it's after an investigation, that's one of the important steps, is looking at what were the gaps that we identified here, how can we improve going forward. In terms of concluding, the best thing that I can leave you with is the question that you want to answer as HR professionals as you look to create a healthy environment is ultimately, do staff feel safe at work? And how do you determine that? Well, you can do an assessment, which is a little mini audit in the workplace, and really it's just testing and asking questions of a few key people and finding out, do they feel safe at work? Do they believe that management, if they filed a complaint, would take that complaint seriously? And do you know how to file a complaint? Right? Like, I would look into those questions at a minimum and do a random survey or something targeted where you want to get answers to those questions. And to the extent that you do that, you'll get some feedback, and it'll help you to really, take the pulse of your workplace and figure out whether or not, folks, do feel safe, whether or not they actually have digested and understand the information that you have been putting out there, and whether or not they've got that confidence, right, at the end of the day, that that if something does go wrong and if they're experiencing problems, that they know how to get help for that. So that's what I'll leave with you, and we have some time here for Q&As, and I want to just encourage you to use that Q&A function to bring your questions forward. While we wait for some questions to come forward, I just want to let you know that we do have another workshop scheduled for April 23rd and 24th. Sorry, when I said workshop, I mean an investigation training session. So for those of you who want to develop those skills in terms of conducting a workplace investigation, we take you through a 2-day training session where we take an investigation scenario from beginning to end. We're going to have actors come in, and you'll get the opportunity to see how to question the complainant in real time, and how to prepare for and put questions to the responding party in real time, and then ultimately, wrestle with that evidence and draft an investigation report. So again, that's coming up on April 23rd and 24th, and just would encourage you to give that some thought for you and your team. and we'd be happy to register you for that event. Please do send me an email to indicate your interest, and we'll get those details off to you.
Dorian, we do have a question today.
Okay, what is
That
that?
is, does your organization offer training on trauma-based interview techniques?
Yeah, we actually offer a training on advanced interview techniques, and a trauma-informed approach would be part of that training session. So we definitely go through how to approach victims of sexual assault and trauma, and how to prepare for those interviews, what to expect. We'll go through the experiences that we've had with in those situations, and provide you with the learning and the tools that you need to approach those interviews with more confidence. So we also in that session go through interviewing difficult witnesses and combative witnesses, and how to deal with the intimidation that you might face in some investigation interviews. I don't see any other questions coming through, but I do want to let you know that we'll make these slides available to you so that you can have them as a reference, and certainly to the extent that you do think of some questions afterwards, please don't hesitate to reach out by email, and I'd be happy to respond and answer any questions that you might have. Also, if you have ideas for future webinars that you'd like to see, please let us know that as well. We're always looking to develop and put content out there that's going to help you to create healthy workplaces. So yeah, we welcome your feedback on this event, and also welcome your suggestion for future events.